I think part of the Downs Bible Week was very kind of public and out there, and to equip people and so on. You used to invite speakers to come in from outside our spheres. What was your thinking there? You mentioned CJ and Larry Tomzak, for instance, but we had Mike Bickle and Mahesh Shavd. No, he came to Stoneleigh, but anyhow, others.
Sure.
What was your thinking in inviting other people in?
I think quite plainly one could see real gifting in people. And I was sometimes, I feel in God's purpose, led across the path of people who I felt could help us. So initially, our very first Downs Bible, we had Bryn Jones speaking and other people from his world, because I think Bryn was ahead of us. He was a real pioneer, tremendous man. I think a lot that did happen would never have happened had it not been for Bryn with his let's go and do it kind of thing. Even he saying to me, you run your Bible week. I mean, it was a Bryn initiative. He is a terrific guy. And so we got Bryn in. And so and again, Bryn would get in these guys from the US, like Ern Baxter, and we had Charles Simpson. We had anyone who could help us so right from the beginning, we had outside voices. I remember Charles Simpson, Ern Baxter speaking. I mean, they just had terrific, they were great teachers about the church, about being discipled, really great values. So one always benefited from other voices. And so then when we had our own Bible week, we would draw in, as you say, Larry, CJ, because they had a terrific message. Yes. And so I always wanted our people to benefit from voices from outside. Now, I think I was just wanting everyone to gain the blessing from what these guys had. I think as the years went by and we began to get our own identity you know, people began to know, oh, New Frontiers. We had a name, we had a bit of an image that was growing now. I never wanted to stop getting outside voices in because I felt we're part of the wider body of Christ. I've always believed in the body of Christ. I've never believed that we were somehow a kind of special. We have a job to do. We want to be true to our calling. But I've always believed in the wider body. So when we used to do meetings in Brighton at the Hove Town Hall, you'd have these what they called celebrations, and we'd always have people from other worlds. Now, to be honest, I would select carefully. Yes. Because I didn't just have high flyers who had a name. I wouldn't go there. I honestly would invite people who I felt who loved the Bible, who loved God, and had got something to add to us, something that we could benefit what they had, they would bring to us. Now, years and years later, when I met people from other movements, they said, other movement leaders said to me, you benefited that you never became locked in because you always had outside speakers. And I've heard people say, we never did. We only had our own speakers. And so it's on reflection, you look back and think, oh, of course. But I wasn't consciously thinking that way. But I think it comes from a theological persuasion that we're part of God's church. Yes. And we are not complete in ourselves. We need, and then meeting like someone like Krianzak and other amazing people. And we benefited hugely from their gift that lifted us beyond where we were. And of course, one who was never a Bible Week speaker, but we benefited hugely from, was John Wimber. And I remember once you were going out to Mexico, I think, and a friend had suggested you ought to get to know this man because you felt you'd have a similar heart. And so you went via California and met up with him. John, didn't you? You met him here first? Yeah, I mean, John was a huge blessing to us, as he has. I would say John Wimber will be second only to Billy Graham in terms of the influence of an American voice coming into the UK. That's a big thing to say, but you know, I can't think of anybody else who's had more impact than John Wimber, which lingers on now. Yes. Hugely now. Yeah, wonderful man. But what happened was I was in South Africa and speaking at some conferences and things, and somebody said to me, because John had been down there the year before. One of his first overseas things was in Cape Town. and South Africa. And they had a lot of impact. And a guy said to me, have you met John Wimber? Well, I'd heard David Watson at the Charismatic Leaders Conference the previous year speak about John Wimber. He had met him and was just blown away. What a wonderful man he is. And so I said, I've heard of him, but I don't know anything. Then I was playing volleyball and got a slip disc on the last day of my time in South Africa. And this guy who had enthused about Wimber to me came to me on my last day and gave me a box of John Wimber tapes, cassettes. I said, here we have these. So I came home and I was on my back for weeks because of this slip disc. And I listened to John Wimber, kind of one after another after another. And I thought, this man is amazing. I loved he had the best theology on healing I'd ever heard. And he was so self-deprecating. He was just a beautiful man. And I'd always felt we need to be seeing more healings, but most people who spoke about healing tended to be a bit forceful, a bit kind of, it's your fault if you're not healed and all this kind of thing, whereas John wasn't a bit like that. He was so much more generous. And his whole theology of it's the kingdom advancing, I loved that theology. So I kind of fell in love with him. But this guy in South Africa said to me, you want to meet John Wimber? I thought, yeah, it'd be nice to meet Billy Graham, but it's not going to happen. And then I had a phone call, I think it was Jeff Sheehan, who said, I've met John Wimber. He was in Kingsway Music. And of course, the Vineyard Music was huge. And he said, he'd like to meet you. And I thought, he'd like to meet me. So I went to his hotel in London. That was when I first met John. Okay. And he said, come and have a coffee. Well, I stayed the whole day with him. We had we just gelled immediately. I had beautiful fellowship with him. And then he said to me, I want to come and do a proper conference. He had just done, or he was in London because he was doing meetings at Westminster Central Hall. I went to one of them. And, Westminster Central Hall was good. But he said, I want to come and do a proper conference. I want to come back to England. I feel I'm meant to do it. What do you think? I said, oh, you ought to come to Brighton. I said, we've got a great conference centre in Brighton. It's modern. There's loads of hotels for people. And we chatted about it. And then I think, I think that came out later. That's right, that came out later. I got to know him there. We had super time. Then he says, you must come to Anaheim. And I said, well, I'm going to Mexico next year. And he said, or in a few months' time, he said, well, come via Los Angeles, it's a way down. So I did. And Ray Lowe and I went to Anaheim. And it was while I was there, he said to me, I want to come to England and I want a conference. And I told him about the Brighton Centre. And he was interested. And then I went down to Mexico and came home. And when I came home, you said to me, Blaine Cook, that's right, John Wimber's administrator, whatever, is coming tomorrow, I think you said, because they want to hire the Brighton Centre.
Well, he just kind of phoned me and said, I want to come and talk about the conference in the Brighton Centre, as if I knew what he was talking about. I hadn't a clue.
Well, you said to me when I got back, John Wimber has said, if Terry's happy, he had phoned the Brighton Centre from California, found a gap they had in their program, and said, if you guys would administrate it for us, we would like to come to the Brighton Centre. And so I thought, wow. And of course, he came several times. And the first 2 or 3, you ran the administration of the Wimber Conference.
And not only in Brighton, but also up in London and in Harrogate. And it was a wild but exciting time. But still. You mentioned South Africa a few moments ago. When you invited a team to join you, one of those was Alan Vincent, and he, as it were, brought India into the orbit, but we were very much south of England and India. At what stage did you feel God was beginning to open up the international scene? And you mentioned South Africa. How did that come about?
Well, I think India, as you say, was the first. It's so interesting that as we were growing and, more and more people, then the Downs Bible Weeks growing up So it has to go to 2 weeks, and you're pushing 10,000, and you've got young people around, and they're beginning to realize this is something happening here. And I would be asked, are you doing overseas mission? And I remember often, I mean, it would happen often, I would say, not yet, but it will come. Because I thought it's got to come. My message is global. It's got to come. But we weren't ready for it. We hadn't got anything ready, no program at all. And then Alan Vincent had spent, I think, 13 years in India, and he came home to a church which was now looking our way. And, he was their very gifted preacher, but he'd been in India for 13 years. So he had this good relationship with 2 or 3 churches where he was in the Watford area. And we got close to Alan. And then Alan said, I'd like you to come out and speak at a conference in Mumbai, what was called Bombay in those days, the church I started. But he used to travel a lot in India, but he got this church in Bombay called Living Word. And would I come out and see it? And I went out and preached at his conference, saw the church. And then I go a second time. And then he said, would you, because by this time Alan was beginning to come very close to us, would I look after, would I take under my apostolic wing, because we began to use that language, the church in Mumbai. So I went out and looked more closely. And it's funny, actually, because to be honest, the church impressed me. It was lovely. But the leadership was not good at all. They were all out of step with one another. And I always felt the leaders' wives hated one another. The leaders were out of step. It was bad news. And so I said, if the leaders will all resign, I will get involved in this church. I thought, well, we'll watch. And they all said yes, which kind of amazed me. So they all stood down. And by that time, the church in Brighton was growing. And Henry Tyler, who was the pastor, and we were bringing through other elders now, Henry said he and his wife would go out to Mumbai and look after this church for, I don't know, it's like 6 months or something. He would pastor them and bring through a fresh leadership. So that wasn't done in one movement. That's what happened, though, that Henry and Dorothy Tyler moved to Mumbai, I don't know, something like 6 months, and looked after the church and brought through fresh leadership. And so that became a church I've frequently visited, like sometimes twice a year. I'd be in Mumbai preaching in that church, and it began to really be brought through fresh leadership. And then Living Word, as it was, began to plant out. And again, the Ephesians 4 team, as you made reference to earlier. So Lex Loizides had emerged as an evangelist by then. And I said to Lex, we're going to plant another church in Mumbai. Would you go and be with them for a year maybe as their evangelist to help them? And he went to Mumbai, and they helped plant Living Hope or Living Light. Well, they planted Living Hope, Living Light, Living this, Living that, until, I mean, the one church in Mumbai became like 4 or 5 churches around Mumbai. And now, I mean, we're talking like 150 churches in India. But it all started with that one. And then you asked about South Africa. I had written the book Restoration in the Church. You referred to it about 84, 85, when to be honest, we are creating a lot of questions. I was interviewed by Christianity magazine, I think it was called Renewal in those days. I was interviewed, and we were getting some notoriety, and I felt I needed to put a book out.
I must just correct you there. Notoriety is a very American word. If it's positive, it's a very negative word in England. I think you mean notability, perhaps.
Well, I think notoriety as well.
Or maybe notoriety as well. Maybe you were intentional.
Well, no, I think to be honest, there was. I mean, I could talk about things that happened.
Fair
but
enough.
I wrote Restoration in the Church to say this is what we're trying to do, and trying to show it's biblical. And to be honest, it was a great success because a lot of people who were hostile to us were amazed at the quotes in the book from people like John Stott, Lloyd Jones, I could find quotations of respected people like Packer and others who said great things which endorsed what we were doing. And so the comeback to the book was, wow, I never thought, because it was biblical. And they thought we were crazy and off the wall, and, you know, a cult. I got accused of leading a cult. But I thought, and so it had a big impact, got reprinted again and again. And so it was a helpful book. And I'd written it, and some guys came over from South Africa and said, we're going to run a conference in a place called East London. We called it Restoration in the Church. Okay. They'd seen the book. They came to Downs Bible Week and asked if I would go.
Right.
And so I went out to speak at the conference, and a guy called Graham Ingram, who used to be the pastor of a church in London that we were now working with, where Phil Rogers was, and John Houghton, and that church had become part of us. And Phil was in contact with his former pastor, who's in Cape Town.
I'd forgotten that.
And he had got filled with the Spirit in a Baptist church in Cape Town and had been thrown out. And a group of, I don't know, 50 or so people went with him. And he'd started a church a year before this conference I went to in East London. And he wrote to me, he said, I understand you are coming to South Africa after the conference. Will you come down to Cape Town? So I said, sure. I mean, and so I went. And initially, Bryn Jones and I were to be the two speakers at this conference this guy was putting on. And we couldn't get the permissions we needed. And it was funny, really, because Bryn said, look, I don't know if we're going to get these permissions to go, government permission. And in the end, he said, oh, I've got another invitation to go to America, I'm going. So he dropped out. But I'm pretty sure I meant to go to this. So I held on, believed I would go. And amazingly, Pam Howarth, who was my secretary at the time, she went to South Africa House, got the document, met me at Heathrow, put it in my hand, and I flew out. I mean, it was that late. And, but I felt sure I was meant to go. We had a superb conference. I had an awful lot of preaching to do because Bryn had dropped. But I met the leaders of several movements, as well as several churches around South Africa. And it resulted in my being invited back many times by, or the guy who leads this movement, the guy who leads this movement, would you come to our church? So I kept on being invited back to South Africa. And I went like once a year, and I'd go to different places. But I always finished up with this church in Cape Town, with Graham Ingram's church, which grew and grew and grew. And then Graham came over to be with us in England to really see what New Frontiers was about. And John Hosier went down to look after they switched so that John could preach for him and so on. And our link with that church became stronger. And then one day, Graham Ingram said to me, I would like to have Simon Pettit. Now, Simon Pettit was leading a church in a very small town in Sussex, but it was enjoying real blessing, quite extraordinary blessing. And he was one of the leaders of this church. And I mean, I thought, I had approached Simon and wondered, was he meant to be in a bigger church? And it was interesting because Graham said to me, will you please ask Simon Pettit if he will come and be my assistant in Cape Town? And I thought, over my dead body. I thought, I don't want to lose Simon. That's how I saw it in those days, be losing Simon. And he said, but I want you to promise me you'll ask. I said, okay, I'll ask him. And I came back, and Wendy and I invited Simon and Lindsay around for an evening. And I spent the evening, and I just said to Simon, do you feel you're meant to be where you are? Is that a kind of sense of, that's a permanent location? And he said, no, I'm just open to where we are now, but I just want to do what God would say. And so I said, well, look, here are some of the places that I think you could be thinking about? And I gave him my little list, which I would be very excited if he'd go there. And I said, oh, and by the way, it's so funny, by the way, I said it very kind of casually. Graham Ingram in Cape Town asked me to say, if, you know, would you consider being his assistant? To my shocked amazement, his eyes opened. Really? I thought, no. I said, really?
Yeah.
He said, we've always thought we might go to Africa. So,
And of course, that was shortly after, I think I'm right in saying, we had taken quite a big team, I mean, 50 people or so, and Simon and Lindsay were on that team.
oh, really? Yes, of course.
To South Africa.
Yes.
To work in the townships. Lex, whom you mentioned earlier, he went as an evangelist, preached on the streets, prayed for the sick for 2 weeks. Others helped build shacks. I now see with hindsight we did it all the wrong way in terms of how we won't go there. But that resulted actually not only in Simon and Lindsay, well, so resulted in, they went back, and of course permanently, but I think 20 of that 50 went back to South Africa for a short term or for a longer term. Some are still there. Not only Simon and Lindsay had a long time there, but Gary and Nikki Welsh, the Underwoods were permanently there.
Yeah,
and so on.
yeah.